Talking in English today, so you'll have a far better standard of French. And I'm going to be talking to you there, yes, as Denis she was saying, about a study that I've just finished. And well, overall there, we need to be aware, constantly be aware of new challenges that young people are facing in order that we can support them effectively. And these challenges can look quite different in different settings and different contexts. But there are some challenges there that often actually are shared across countries. And one of those, for example, actually is social media and new technology, where there actually are, I'd argue there are some similarities there in terms of different developed countries. So I'm going to be talking a little there about, one study actually about the developing risks and challenges in London. Hopefully there actually will be something that has maybe some links there, maybe some contrasts or some comparisons in Canada. And what, so just looking there in general there, looking about social media and technology, that they're very central to the lives of young people. So that they are, and this actually can be quite a challenge for us as professionals there, because they can develop at a speed that actually is quite difficult for us to keep up with, which I suspect is part of the attraction for young people. And it can provide really positive things that I'm going to talk about there. However, the new technologies follow the contours of human nature, and that means there that they can kind of present some challenges that organisations like street gangs actually are using in terms of to promote to work in an exploitative way. But first of all, I don't want you to have the sense that I am saying social media and technology is terrible. There are many positive things. That the internet provides a space that actually is far freer, and where people actually enjoy kind of more freedom than many other areas of their life where there are maybe more kind of restrictions. And they offer increased individualization there for young people, for them to reach out to other people with the same interests, posing the same challenges, with the same hopes and fears. Just thinking there actually of for example, there young people there who actually are gay or lesbian or experience gender variant. This can provide an international kind of community that can really be quite supporting in ways that actually, for previous generations, are likely to experience more isolation. But just overall, the young people, well, not only young people, but all of us there, are now freer from the constraints of geography than we have been at any other period in human history. So there are positive things in there. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit there about where this study actually is located. This actually is in Waltham Forest, which is in the northeast of London. London has 31 boroughs there, and it actually is an area that actually is traditionally been relatively poor and working class, or has large kind of immigrant communities. That in terms of London and to most of the actual countries in the UK, the areas to the east, and particularly the northeast of the city, tend to be the poorer areas. This actually was because during the period of the Industrial Revolution, when there was the factories that were belching out lots of smoke, we actually have a predominantly northeasterly wind. And so the factories were then blowing all the pollution out to the northeast. And obviously the factories actually have long gone, but the inequalities that were there have remained. Now, on the left-hand side there is a map of the local area looking at the 13 gangs and the particular areas that they control. And I'll be talking a little bit more about them. Now, what actually is quite lucky actually about this study is that we're kind of following up 10 years on. There was a study that was done 10 years ago, a classic study in terms of British studies actually of gangs. It was the first main study done of gangs that was exactly in this area. But we actually were kind of called in 10 years on because actually the local authority who commissioned both of the studies felt that things actually had changed. There was something there that actually was happening that they actually were very concerned about. And they brought us in order to get a sense of actually what's different, what's actually happening. And looking at 10 years ago, the study that actually was called Reluctant Gangsters was published. And what John Pitts found there, it's called the Reluctant Gangsters because what he found was that there were a number of young people in the local area who didn't really want to become involved with gangs. But because the local area was controlled by a particular gang, they felt more vulnerable not being in a gang. So for them, actually, being part actually of a gang felt like it actually was protective. Now, what we know, and my colleagues actually kind of in the States there found out, that this actually is a fallacy. You know, if you actually become a gang member there, you're more likely to be victimized. But psychologically, it feels like you're safer. Now, what he found at that time there was that the gangs were very much focused upon postcodes. And what gang members there, talked about an emotional connection to the local area. One young person there kind of famously said, I would defend anybody in my postcode. And at that point, that period of time, gang membership was shown through gang colours. People actually would wear, particular colours, particular clothing in order to show that they were part of a particular gang, and this would mean that they had a visible presence on the street. 10 years on, that had changed quite considerably. So the gang colours actually have long gone, and what we actually have found was that gangs actually have a far more ruthless operating model. We've called it from postcodes to profit, because what we've seen is that the gangs have operating, the way that they're operating now is actually far more focusing upon the drugs market. And it actually is operating in a way that it is actually quite economically driven. Now, territory, this doesn't mean that territory isn't important, but it has a different meaning. Whereas 10 years ago, the local area was a postcode to be defended, whereas now it is a drugs market to be protected. That's it. And that changes there in terms of the actual resources they're required to defend a whole postcode, actually quite considerable, but actually kind of protecting actually a very specific strip, a particular area there that gangs deal from actually is far more focused and far more doable. And also there's another way in which that they have changed, is that whereas 10 years ago there was quite a lot of actually rivalry between gangs. It was rare to see any form of alliances. Now what we are seeing is that gangs are forming alliances, but they're like business alliances where they actually are grouping together because of the economies of scale, means that they can actually get their drugs, they can buy drugs actually there for a cheaper price. So they also have access to actually kind of better drugs, and also they can actually use, so what you often would get actually is a very powerful gang, and then you'd have other gangs operate underneath its umbrella, and that actually take advantage of its reputation for violence. So it actually is there's something there that the other gangs can actually gain from actually that reputation for violence, but then also kind of the main gang there can also draw upon them if there actually are conflicts with other gangs. Now, looking at what you've actually got there is a table with the names of the gangs. On the left-hand side, it actually is the original gangs 10 years ago. And on the right-hand side there, you have got the current gangs. Now, as you will see there, there are only 4 gangs from those original kind of gangs that still exist. The other gangs there have simply disappeared. Now, to some extent there, that can be explained in terms of, gang members there kind of growing up. They actually have got jobs, they actually have got relationships, they've got family, and simply they actually have dissolved. And but also actually there, in terms of actually involvement actually in the drugs market there, it almost actually is like a sort of, they're looking at it from the business model there. It's almost like startups. There in lots of markets there, a lot of new starters actually there will fail. And then what you'll get is actually a small number there that will gain a much more powerful market. And so on the right-hand side, you'll see there the original kind of gangs that are in bold, and those are the gangs that still exist. You also will see a border around these actual 5 gangs here. And the main gang there, the actual Marley Boys, which actually is a splinter group from the Beaumont crew, is actually the most powerful group, the most powerful gang, and that the other 4 gangs there operate underneath their umbrella. Now, looking at about how gangs develop, there actually was a model there, James Densley and I have been working on. He originally developed it, and it fitted very much in terms of what we were seeing in terms of the gangs. Now, at the very first stage, in terms of gang development there, you have the recreational stage. At that stage, often it actually is young people there that know each other through school, through friendships, through family connections, neighbourhood connections. And they are, very much actually is about a shared history. Now, at this stage there, crime is actually rarely acquisitive. Normally it actually is about violence actually with other gangs, other young people there, or about graffiti. And the majority of gangs there will never get beyond this stage. But what we kind of found actually was that a number of gangs there over that period have then moved into a crime stage. Now, this is actually when you start to see kind of acquisitive crime becoming a far more focused. And crime is actually used as a means of supporting the gang's activities. It actually is what they do in order to have an income to carry on doing what they're doing. And at that stage there, then gang members will gain respect, will be involving actually in terms of criminal activities, in terms of violence there, as a means of gaining respect and working their way up, in terms of the pecking order. My colleague Simon Hardy used the idea of Pierre Bourdieu, the idea of capital, the idea of street capital there, that you actually, reputational capital that you use in order to actually to work your way up in terms of the gangs. Now, but actually, as they go through this stage, there they start to actually have to become more organised, more kind of cohesive, in order to survive. And again, some of them actually kind of don't make that, whereas other of them move on to the next stage. And the next stage there is the enterprise stage. At this stage there, whereas previously crime was a means to an end, that at this stage there, crime becomes the raison d'être. So and certainly for kind of the London gangs, that actually has been very much focused around the drugs market. Now, in order, a part of that becoming more organised there is what you will usually see, and certainly what we actually saw is that the original founding members become actually the top layer, the kind of inner circle, the ones there who actually are making the actual key decisions there in terms of the strategic direction. Then you will have a middle layer that will be the olders, or they're sometimes called generals or enforcers, and their role is about the operational management for the drugs market. So that their role will be actually doing the operational kind of management and recruiting in new street dealers. And the street dealers there are the bottom layer, known as the youngers. And that, say they are, or the soldiers, they actually are the people that you will see visibly on the street. They're the ones that are doing all of the actual street dealing. And in terms of the actual kind of ages there, In terms of London, what we're kind of seeing there is that in terms of youngers, we're typically talking about 12 to 15. The enforcers there, the generals, the middle layer there, tend to be about kind of 15 through kind of to 18, 19, and then you'll see the older kind of people there will be actually kind of late teens through into their 20s. And the third stage actually is the extra governance stage. Now, this actually is where it starts to look a lot more like kind of organised crime, where they actually are kind of infiltrating and they're trying to actually get a monopoly on a particular market. Now, that's very difficult there in terms of the drugs market, in terms of London there, because actually it actually is, there are just so many different kind of competitors actually in that market. That there are some markets, such as in terms of firearms, that actually are, that actually have got a very kind of restricted kind of market there, but they actually are part of actually other types of organised crime. It's difficult for street gangs to actually break into that market. But what we're kind of seeing is actually some ways there in which the gangs, some of the actual kind of gangs are starting to do a little bit of this. Say, for example, there we actually had what the actual gangs will do is that they will intimidate local businesses to make sure that that many of them have got closed-circuit CCTV cameras outside, and they will make sure they will intimidate them to actually turn those cameras away from the drug dealing areas, because then obviously, so that to make sure that they don't get caught. And another example there actually was recently that one of the actual gangs took over a fast food chain. So they infiltrated the fast food chain. So it then became, that was where people could go in order to actually kind of buy drugs. So we're seeing some things of them actually kind of moving. Now, in terms of, now one of the actual things about that enterprise stage there is that the actual scale of our operations actually are growing considerably. One of the actual 13 gangs operating in the local area, just say one of the 13 would have, currently has a turnover of about 75,000 Canadian dollars a week. Now, in terms of an operation of that side, you need to actually have a lot of street dealers. You need to have a lot of kind of youngers. And so, say, for example, there, I was talking with one of the senior police, the borough commander, and he was saying, well, a couple of weeks ago, what we did was that we had an operation and we went out and we arrested 57 street dealers. But within 48 hours, they'd all been replaced. It's like a cab rank. And this quote here actually is from one of the former gang members that we spoke to, who was in that middle layer and was responsible for recruitment. And what he described here is the operating model, the mindset. He describes there about when he's out and he's recruiting, what's he looking for? Well, what he's looking for is what he describes as weak people, people that don't see their future. See it? Because those are the ones that you can influence. And he describes there about befriending actual kind of younger people there, and finding that it was very easy there, showing them actually some attention, buying them some chicken and chips, was something there that actually was very effective in terms of hooking in that young person. And as he said, before you actually know it there, that person now is on the bus going somewhere else. And as we know, that in terms of a gang membership, once young people actually realise how deep that they're in too deep. It's very difficult for them to actually get out of gang activity. There is what we found there was, for example, there some examples. We actually had a 14-year-old boy who his mother, he lived actually there with his mother. His mother worked long hours working in a care home, doing kind of care work, and he actually was then on his own a lot. The gang, he also had been excluded from school. He actually was in a special, what we call a pupil referral unit for children that are excluded from mainstream school. He'd been befriended by gangs, and what actually had happened was he had a phone call there at 3 o'clock in the morning saying there is an Uber outside with a sports bag which was full of crack. What we want you to do is go and actually take the Uber will collect you there, and then it's going to take you to a town, about 2 hours away, where you're going to go to a trap house. Now, when that young boy actually arrived there, within half an hour, he was the place where he was actually was broken into by 4 men that came in, that stole the drugs, and then stabbed him in the buttocks. And what the actual police strongly suspect is that those 4 men actually were known to the gangs. They were associated to the gangs. But what that young person actually was told is, like, you've lost those drugs, that they actually were worth $4,000 or $5,000 there. You now owe us. So now, essentially we own you. So you've got to kind of now carry on kind of working for us to work off your debt. It's a form of debt bondage that actually is really kind of quite controlling. Now, looking at social media and the role of new technology, what we found was that the gangs were actually divided into 2 camps. So they very much actually had divided them into 2 very different approaches. Now, the first approach there was that the gang had rejected, was a set of gangs there that rejected social media. And because they regarded it as simply as it's bad for business. So, that social media there, what you're doing is that it attracts attention from law enforcement agencies. So the best thing to do is to actually keep below the radar, keep invisible. And so, for example, young people that become street dealers will be given old-style Nokia phones or burner phones. And these are ones there that can be bought from a corner shop and that aren't actually traceable back to actually any individual. And they don't leave any digital footprint. You can't take, there's no geolocation, no GPS, there's you can't really take proper photographs. So this means there, as one of the gang members actually said, frankly, everyone avoids social media because they're paranoid of the state. The police can go through your phone. So if you're arrested there, then there's nothing there that's going to be incriminating for the gang. So that all of the actual dealing is actually done via telephone calls from other burner phones, so that there's no link back in terms of individuals. But what was interesting was that the same set of gangs, it wasn't that they were completely rejecting technology. In fact, what they were doing was that they were actually going onto social media such as Facebook in order to find out information about police officers. So they would go on to social media there in order to find out whether police officers actually had children, about family members. So in the case of a face-to-face confrontation, they could use that information in order to try to intimidate the police officer. But also they used other means there. They actually stood outside the police station in order to take photographs of the actual car, the private number plates there of the police officers. Now, this wasn't really very practically useful because they couldn't really do anything for that, but it was more like a war of intimidation. Now, in terms of the second type of gang, had the opposite approach. Their approach was very much to embrace social media, and a means there of, for the senior level there, was a means of promoting their brand. So what you kind of see there are really quite expensive, quite sophisticated professional music videos that would be used as a means of, and you would never actually see, although the actual young people actually would be there in the videos, you wouldn't see actually any of the older people. They'd very much be staying off the radar. And what they would do is that if they were moving into a new town, what they would do is they'd use that as a means of, they would record videos in that town, show them on YouTube, as a means of advertising, we're in your area. So it actually advertises to new customers, and it also scares off local dealers to say, we are a scary London gang, we've got knives, we've got guns, don't get in our way. Now, for them, if you actually are a street dealer, for them, when you actually, what you'll be given actually is a smartphone, which obviously for young people there actually is very attractive. But on there are GPS apps that the enforcers, the generals, the middle level will use actually as a means of actually seeing exactly where people are. So use it as a form of coercive control. So they can check there that young people are exactly where they're meant to be. And my actual, one of my colleagues there actually doing some research looking actually at the area of domestic violence and finding the same thing there about perpetrators of domestic abuse using actually the same GPS technology there in order to track their partners. But also it can be used there in terms of promotion. So one of the ways in which they do actually is using apps like Snapchat, which provide actual images there that have a limited amount of time. So they may use them there in terms of advertising drugs, so they can advertise there to actually to potential customers there about what they have, but they will then disappear with time. Now, one of the things about in terms of social media there that is quite different to 10 years ago. In John Pitt's original study 10 years ago, social media was not mentioned. It just, for me, it actually made me realise actually how recent social media is. So that Twitter, was just not used 10 years ago, and what you actually had then was that the violence that happened between gangs would happen in street fights that would actually happen periodically. But now, well, one can argue there that a lot of those conflicts happen now on the internet, which in one sense there could be seen as potentially positive. They're acting out kind of conflict there, but they're acting it out in a virtual kind of territory. Unfortunately, often that conflict then spills out into real world violence. And the problem actually is for those gangs that are very much wanting to be social media players, they know that you have to provide a constant stream of interesting content. And content that is about conflict grabs people's attention. That's equally as true for gang members as it is for presidents. So the problem actually there is, so there's that need there, that kind of constant appetite for conflict-related content. But also, in those street fights that happened 10, 15 years ago, there were usually very few bystanders. So if gangs went in, it didn't go their way, well, afterwards they could still kind of present it actually kind of in a far more positive way. But actually kind of now, if somebody is then videoing that, and then that's going on the internet, well, that's potentially is an audience of thousands, tens of thousands. Some of the actual gangs there have got very, very large YouTube following. And also it's something there that those conflicts can be actually replayed again and again. Now, one of the actual challenges of the professionals working actually with young people involved with gangs is the very kind of, often the very negative media coverage around gangs, the sort of the moral panics that can happen. And that's something that we actually had this year, that the background actually is that this year there were lots of media stories there that the number of young people that actually had been, the number of people there had been murdered actually in London, I think it's for 1 month there, had actually was greater than that of New York. See, although New York actually, the murder figures actually been dropping for quite a long time. So there actually were lots of kind of media stories actually around this. And these actually were all actually around risk. The gang members actually were very much seen in terms of risk. But what we know, and Kath this morning actually was talking about it in terms of actually of in relation to child abuse there, but that gang members there in terms of actually their mental health experience very high levels of poor mental health. That actually, certainly in terms of London, the research done in London there, 2/3 of them actually have an anxiety disorder, often linked with PTSD. 1/3 of them will have attempted suicide, and 1 in 4 of them will have experienced a psychotic episode. That actually is massive. But actually, in terms of, when I've been going around talking about the research there, and I've been talking actually about that, in terms of the media there, people are really surprised because the stories are often very negative ones around risk and rarely around vulnerability. And what also actually was very striking was about that the gangs actually kind of attract very different they're portrayed in very different ways across the political spectrum and get different kind of responses. It was very interesting actually doing a piece of research that actually got, quite a bit of media coverage across that spectrum. One of the most striking ones was this story, which is an American story there that was linked to the Breitbart press. They did a story there. Progressive London being overrun by gangs. So that and essentially they're making the argument that the problem actually in terms of London is that actually ordinary citizens don't carry guns. So the problem actually there with London is it just needs more guns. Now this actually was an article that actually had linked with the gun industry, so it probably shouldn't be too kind of surprising that actually was their angle. And on the other side actually there, the socialist worker there were very much actually arguing that the study proved that actually that the gang kind of culture was very much around government cuts. It was about kind of racism, which was a kind of message that actually is, kind of probably actually kind of more palatable, but at the same time didn't really bear any relationship to kind of what was in the report. And I started off by talking about the individualization of social media. And that kind of, for me, actually was something that was, in a way, kind of a little bit chilling. Now, looking back 10 years ago, people actually got their news through television, mainstream television programs, mainstream newspapers, and each would have a particular kind of slant, would have a particular kind of political orientation. But, there would be kind of quite a lot of actually kind of agreement. It really wouldn't look that different across for a lot of kind of stories. Whereas if you actually get your news through social media, well, algorithms will personalize that for you. Just like if you're going on, big retailers like Amazon, they will quickly learn what things that you like. People have mixed views on that, but, it's quite different there in terms of news. If I was very much actually part of the gun lobby, then the algorithms will tailor it so that the news that I get will be positive news stories there actually around kind of gun possession. May actually have a particular slant there in terms of issues like kind of immigration. And what's kind of occurred to me actually there was that the individualization of social media is actually could potentially present quite a lot of kind of challenges there in terms of democracy, in terms of polarizing views, as people receive a constant stream of news stories that reinforce their particular views. So just finishing off now in terms of looking there in terms of some of the solutions that in London we are exploring at the moment. And although the actual kind of challenges actually may be quite international, often the actual solutions are quite local. They're well known to professionals because they draw upon the relationships that professionals have with young people and the other, community kind of structures, community kind of strength there. They're very much actually rooted within those communities. In terms actually of London there, additional resources have been identified in terms of actually early intervention for young people who actually have been identified at a risk of actually becoming involved in terms of gangs. That a pilot scheme has been launched that screens young people that are young people there at the moment who are arrested and are remanded in custody, who actually are under the age of 18, will receive a mental health screening by a mental health professional in order to actually kind of find out, to see actually there whether there are any undiagnosed mental health needs that may be actually linked with the offending there, that actually kind of that will then enable them to actually fast track to support. Another thing there that actually is being tried is that the police force, Metropolitan Police Force, the London police force there have got a specialist team, and they constantly monitor social media. So that, say, for example, if actually a gang has actually been posting on YouTube their videos in relation to kind of a growing conflict with another gang, they will then intervene. They actually will have developing relationships there with key people in order to actually go out face to face to say, you know, kind of, is this escalating? Do you want some form of mediation? And so that's kind of something new there. We're kind of testing that. That actually has been, you know, tried elsewhere, in terms of kind of Cincinnati, and then later on in terms of Glasgow, often within, you know, street advocates, people who have previously been involved with gangs. So we'll see how that works there. So London actually has adopted, just a few months ago there, has adopted a public health approach to violence reduction, really actually in response to, just like that, the borough commander, the police kind of commander, who actually was saying to me that, well, you know, we went off, we arrested actually those 57 street dealers there. They all got replaced. This is not a problem that we can simply just arrest our way out of. Now, and this actually is using kind of an approach there that was developed in Cincinnati with some links with Boston, has actually, for the last 10 years, has actually been tried in Glasgow with some actually very positive results. We're now talking about adopting that in London. But also finally there, very recently there, the UK has adopted modern slavery legislation. And that's to address a whole range of issues. But it is currently actually being used, a couple of months ago, it was used for the first successful prosecution of for where children actually are, young people actually are being used to transport drugs to other areas. And yeah, it led to actually a successful prosecution. And also what we're seeing is that, in terms of Waltham Forest itself, is actually using financial investigation so as a means of being able to actually kind of address those actual, to target those senior gang members there, rather than just the street dealers who are far more visible. Okay. Hope that was interesting. Thank you.